true story of friendship, strength, courage and an impossible mountain. The BAFTA-winning Touching the Void is over on our new channel, More 4 Now. Here on Channel 4, is there anybody out there?
This is a journey into a world of mystery and deceit, a fantastical place full of UFOs, strange encounters, and stories of alien abduction. My name is Nick Cook. I'm a defense journalist. My job is to investigate secret programs, the shadow defense industry, worth billions of dollars but hidden from public view. I dig out evidence of clandestine technologies concealed behind a network of false trails and military smokescreens. In this film, I'm going into a world that is taboo for a journalist like me. Now, more people than ever believe in UFOs. I want to know what really has been flying through our airspace. Do these sightings offer evidence of top-secret military and defense technology? Or do they hold the clues to something more mysterious? My plan is to trace the phenomenon through each decade, from early sightings of UFOs during the Second World War to the mass reports of alien abductions that swept America in the 80s and 90s. In between, I'll be investigating such landmark cases as the Roswell incident and the Zamora sighting to try to answer the question, are UFOs real?
People send me pictures like these every week, and most of them are pretty obvious hoaxes. But very occasionally, something genuinely intriguing arrives. Like this one, for example, a picture taken by a Canadian Air Force pilot on a military exercise. And what it shows is indeed quite startling. I've seen many pictures like this, all of them taken by aircrew, people who are trained to record data. UFOs are a taboo subject in the military, and very much for an aerospace journalist like me. Pilots who report them risk being grounded, or perhaps even referred to a psychiatrist for an assessment. So these pictures tend to arrive on my desk anonymously, and for good reason. But these pictures resonate with me because the matter of who you share airspace with when you're traveling at twice the speed of sound really is a matter of life and death. I've spent 20 years writing about leading-edge aerospace technology. I've probably interviewed thousands of pilots in that time. A handful of them are reporting UFO incidents that are genuinely mysterious. I want to know what it is, though, these men are really seeing.
The history of UFO sightings is not a long one, but it's a bit longer than most people suspect. To start to make sense of UFOs, you must go back 63 years. To the Second World War and these men, and what some of them saw in the night skies over Europe. Allied aircrews described strange glowing balls of light that tracked their aircraft, and even coined a name for them, Foo Fighters.
This is one of the first recorded reports of a UFO sighting. It's taken from the official RAF archives, and it is highly unusual. It recounts the story of one pilot officer called B.C. Lumsden, who saw something extremely unusual during a bombing raid over Germany on the 7th of December 1942.
light on red too?
We were cruising at 7,000 feet.
when we discovered we had company, an orange-coloured light off the port wing. At first I thought it was tracer flak, but discounted this when I saw how slowly and controlled it was moving.
What the hell is it?
It seemed to be playing with Red Tooth, diving around the fuselage. Suddenly, it turned starboard and headed straight for us. I found it hard to make other members of the squadron believe me, but the following night, one of the squadron flight commanders had a similar experience, with a green light.
It's gone! It's gone! It's gone!
A handful of Foo Fighters sightings could be dismissed as pilot error, but there were hundreds, if not thousands. Could they really just be the hallucinations of tired or terrified men? I've decided to find out more about these strange balls of fire. Military historians Dave Clark and Andy Roberts are leading experts on UFO sightings during the Second World War.
People were seeing tiny balls of light, not much bigger than a beach ball, say, to full-blown flying saucers in the style that we would appreciate today. And there's a problem of reporting them at debriefing, because if you had bomber crews landing and saying, you know, we saw these peculiar lights chasing us for miles and miles and miles, some of the bomber crews I've spoken to were fearful that they'd get grounded for lack of moral fibre, for inventing things to get them grounded, some form of psychological problem. First, the RAF and the Air Ministry were extremely concerned because they thought perhaps it was some form of German secret weapon. And it is known that the Nazis did have some quite novel varieties of anti-aircraft, such as Scarecrow and things of that nature, which threw huge metal bars around in the sky, which people saw. And that was designed to unnerve people as much as to damage aeroplanes.
These designs, lifted from secret engineering blueprints seized by the Allies at the end of the war, show just how radical the Nazis' aerospace programs were. And it was plans like these that were unsettling the Allied forces.
Going through American files of the kind of technological plunder operation that they did on Germany after the war, they do describe technologies that could be pieced together to develop a kind of Foo Fighter type weapon.
They were working on all these bizarre little things, but none of these things ever came to fruition. Had the war gone on much longer, or had the Germans won, then we may have seen these things develop in the same way that we saw the Americans develop space technology after the war.
The evidence for Foo Fighters is intriguing, but I wonder whether there is anything more than the log reports by the pilots who described screaming dogfights with strange balls of light. I've come to meet American technology historian John Dering. He has first-hand information on the development of Foo Fighters.
I interviewed a German aircraft engineer who had actually worked on these vehicles in the prototype stage and in the early phases of production. These were vehicles that were unmanned. They were what we would probably best describe today as unmanned aerial combat vehicles. These were vehicles that were not just sent up for surveillance purposes, they actually had a purpose of remotely controlled to engage the Allied aircraft, the bombers in particular, by basically trying to apply a mechanism that was not necessarily a catastrophic destructive effect, such as blowing the Foo Fighter up and taking the aircraft down. This was intended to be something that could be reused multiple times.
There's plenty of anecdotal evidence that Allied air crewmen saw these things over Germany, but what about hard evidence on the ground that this technology was actually pursued by the Germans?
One of the reports that I have seen and looked over was in reference to a project in the Black Forest that involved a small vehicle that was specifically intended to be an interceptor for advanced air defense against Allied bombers. Now that document actually came from a U.S. intelligence officer, and so I have pretty high certainty that that was real.
I want to follow up on John Dering's research. His work indicates there was secret technology being developed in Nazi-occupied Central Europe, which might account for some of the UFO sightings. These are the Sudeten Mountains on the Polish-Czech border. During World War II, this beautiful valley was home to some of the finest scientific minds of the Third Reich. It was here that the Nazis built one of their underground research facilities, the Wenceslas mine. I'm meeting Polish military historian Igor Witkowski, who will guide me round the mine, a vast underground complex hidden away from Allied bombs, which Nazi slave labour carved out of the Sudeten Mountains.
Example of a surface infrastructure being kind of a reflection of the underground facility, which was...
It was here, in the desperate last months of the war, that German scientists worked around the clock to produce Kriegensscheiden, the war-winning technology that might produce a stunning knockout blow, even as the Nazis were being pushed back towards Germany. As Igor guided me through the flooded tunnels, the air became heavy and difficult to breathe.
So in effect, we've come hundreds of meters through this complex, and we're now deep into the mountain.
Not hundreds of meters, but several kilometers, in fact.
This is several kilometers into the mountain.
Yes.
And this would have been a highly secure, impenetrable assembly site.
Exactly, and the secrecy around this place was very exceptional, so that the Allies never found out about it.
Almost nothing exists of the original mine. As the Nazis retreated in 1945, they sealed most of the tunnels, leaving the advanced technology, and some say the scientists who developed it, buried beneath impenetrable walls of rock. But the Allies did capture one man who knew all about this place, and he wasn't a token find. His name was SS General Jakob Sporenberg, and he was in charge of the technical program at the mine. What he revealed astonished his interrogators. Indeed, I find it astonishing 60 years later. He spoke of a secret experiment attempting nothing less than to conquer gravity. He described a bell-shaped device that needed enormous amounts of electrical power. It was made of a hard, heavy metal and filled with a mercury-like substance that was violet in colour and glowed when under test. People who worked on the bell suffered from sleep problems and severe vertigo. 5 of the 7 scientists died while working on the project. In a memo to Hitler, the scientists wrote, "It is in our opinion that the scientific results ascertained from our experiments with the bell are truly decisive for the war." Experiments with the bell happened deep underground in the mine, but directly above it, on the surface, was this strange structure. Called the flytrap, it first showed up on an Allied aerial reconnaissance photo in 1944. Igor Witkowski believes that the flytrap was a test rig for advanced propulsion technology. In other words, flying saucers.
There is a extremely strong and thick steel reinforcement of the pillars, which means that it was to withstand some great forces working on it.
How did it work? We don't know exactly, but we do know from Sporenberg's evidence that the bell was a revolutionary device. and the flytrap, designed as its test rig, was fed with underground cables running to the heart of the structure.
So the cabling led down here,
Right
or
away
rather from the power station over there.
yes, up to the flytrap.
Right.
It was
Well, they're actually
virtually filled with high voltage
Yeah.
cables, as thick as an arm.
Right.
You know, that thickness. I have photographs of them, and that's just another strange fact that point out to such a possibility that it would have been used for some experimental purposes.
I mean, they're actually pretty sizable. It's kind of like 1.5 meters of,
Yeah.
of
Pretty-
concrete-lined ducting down here.
Yes, exactly. Pretty solid.
So it all adds up to, I mean, pretty strong evidence that the power station over there was feeding this tremendous amount of power to the facility, the flytrap over there.
Just there, exactly.
Yeah.
In a way, no, very strong.
What Witkowski has uncovered is interesting. I've spent a long time researching the quest to produce anti-gravity technology, the holy grail of aerospace design. Is it possible that the UFO sightings over Nazi Germany were related to this quest?
There is a sense here that the Germans were engaged in very highly classified work, and that possibly they were engaged in anti-gravity type programs.
What I do know is that many of these bizarre projects like the Bell did not remain in German hands. At the end of the war, they were plundered secretly by the American High Command and taken to the States. The speculation about Foo Fighters was about to be overshadowed by one of the most sensational UFO sightings of all, the 1947 incident at Roswell in New Mexico. That's where I'm heading next.
The 509th Atomic Bomb Group headquarters at Roswell, New Mexico, reports that it has received one of the discs which landed on a ranch outside Roswell. Colonel William Blanchard of the Roswell Air Base refuses to give details of what the flying disc looks like.
In July 1947, a UFO is supposed to have exploded in midair over Roswell, New Mexico, showering its debris over a remote ranch nearby. The actual saucer itself is said to have come down here on the plains of San Agustin. UFO proponents doggedly say that this vehicle that allegedly crashed here was extraterrestrial.
The Roswell crash is the best known case in the annals of ufology. Supporters of the extraterrestrial explanation claim that the military recovered crash debris and alien bodies from a site located on the very edge of a top-secret military base called White Sands. The press had a field day. Reports of a crashed disc hit the headlines, and Roswell quickly became a national controversy. The military were quick to quash stories of bodies and saucers, but their denials just fueled the belief that they were hiding something. The rumors about Roswell refused to die. I've come here to White Sands to find out the reason. There's something strange about the sky here. I'm over 5,000 feet above sea level, and the air is crystal clear. I've come to meet Mike Smith and Wayne Matson, two ex-Air Force officers who have lived in the area for some time. Mike explains that the desert climate can throw strange shapes into the air.
A lot of them are astronomical phenomena that in our desert atmosphere here provides practically an infinity of weather conditions which can really play tricks with the eyes. And I have seen things that were perfectly explainable that really looked like something totally extraordinary, but they were explainable.
And as Wayne tells me, even cloud formations can be misleading.
Lenticular clouds are often mistaken for UFOs.
Pretty extraordinary, aren't they?
Lenticular clouds the wind comes hitting the mountains, swoops up, and as it goes over the top, the clouds form. I have seen a half a dozen UFOs, lenticular clouds that were one, about a minute later, a second one, and so on.
The cloud story may explain some of the unusual sights witnessed in this area, but it doesn't begin to account for the Roswell incident. Debris was recovered from the crash site, so there is physical evidence that something did come down on the plains of San Agustin. But the mystery surrounding Roswell comes from the fact that the US Air Force changed their version of events 3 times. I've discovered that one of those stories was linked to a covert military operation flying out of the Roswell area. Duke Gildenberg worked on a secret balloon program called Skyhook, designed to fly covert missions over the Soviet Union.
The Skyhook balloon wasn't born until 1947, and therefore, when it first appeared and for the first 5-10 years, it was a new sight in the sky. Holloman Air Force Base, then Alamogordo Air Base, was the prime launch site for the United States Air Force, and it happens to be just upwind of Roswell, so when the balloons would climb out, even if they were going to go 1,000 miles the other way, the initial climb out would be in the direction of Roswell, close enough to see, even if they get right overhead. Every flight we flew generated UFO reports. In fact, for a while, we were even using it as a backup tracking system. We call up a town and say, anybody see a UFO this afternoon? Yeah, one to the, okay, what direction? To the south? Okay, keep an eye on it. We allowed them to remain UFO reports, with the hope being that once they got over the Soviet Union, they'd still be registered as UFO rather than our reconnaissance balloons.
But in one incident, the UFO cover story broke down, leading to a famous US-Soviet standoff.
Yeah, we faithfully promised President Eisenhower that we wouldn't get shot down, but we were, for a few, and we wound up with Khrushchev at the UN exhibiting on the table one of our payloads, perhaps with my initials on it, banging his shoe on the desk and protesting because we were overflying his country with cameras.
Is Roswell explicable as a balloon crash?
That is correct. I worked on the Pentagon report for months and months and months, and looking at all the testimony, it was really obvious that one was a balloon landing in '47. There was another one maybe a couple weeks later that wound up being described in the Telegraph to J. Edgar Hoover, and it described it as a balloon.
As credible as Gildenberg's explanation sounds, I'm not convinced. I've come across a memo that suggests there was more to the incident than the Air Force was admitting.
For the way Joe tells the story.
In September 1947, just a few weeks after the Roswell crash, General Twining, head of the Air Materiel Command, issued a classified memo to a small group of his senior officers outlining his concern about the rash of flying saucer sightings that had been seen across America earlier that summer. In the memo, he states that the phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious, that there were objects approximating the shape of a disk in the sky. He talks of operating characteristics such as extreme rates of climb and maneuverability. One of his conclusions, indeed, is that these disks might be the product of some high-security project not known to his command.
The Twining memo shows the Air Force was taking the flying saucer sighting seriously. I'm going to interview someone who has high security clearance and who might throw light on what really crashed at Roswell. I'm here to see John Alexander, Vietnam vet, ex-Special Forces and military intelligence. He's taken a close interest in the Roswell incident.
Part of the problem has been the government itself. On Roswell, they have been less than forthcoming. They've been caught time after time just overtly lying to the public. And so the government's credibility in this field is pretty damn low. So you can't, they can't come out and say, well, here's the truth today.
Do you think that these vehicles have crashed to Earth, and do you think that the US military has recovered them?
No.
Why not?
Why? I'll tell you why not. And this is where I get in trouble with everybody. I looked. I am, kind of the one person who has gone nose to nose with the head of all of the intelligence agencies and whatnot. We looked from a historical perspective. I can mention now that Edward Teller was one of the folks who was interested in my work in other fields.
Edward Teller. He was the head of weapons research at Los Alamos and father of the H-bomb. If alien technology had been found by the military, he would surely have known about it.
I actually had him over for dinner. We had this discussion. He was not opposed to the notion of UFOs. We always said if 5 people knew at that time, Teller would have been one of them, because understanding energy, and he was the one who was working on the most advanced energy source known at the time, and you get the absolutely not.
So Teller told Alexander that whatever it was that crashed at Roswell, it was not extraterrestrial. But I still don't buy Gildenberg's story about a balloon crash. So my thoughts are moving back to the Second World War and the work of the German scientists. Could the American operation to capture those scientists and their technology offer any clues to what really happened at Roswell?
In 1945, President Truman ordered a secret operation codenamed Project Paperclip. It instructed the US military in Germany to round up German scientists and persuade them to carry on their work in America.
This is where most of the Paperclip scientists ended up. White Sands Missile Range, a top-secret base surrounded by a no-go zone the size of a small country.
Probably well over 2,000 scientists were brought to this country. I have a listing, which I got from the Air Force History Office, of all the scientists that were brought to Wright Field. And nearly 200 top-of-the-line scientists were brought to Wright Field. The Germans were anywhere from 5 to 15 years ahead in certain areas. For instance, you think of the V-2A4 missile, not intercontinental at that time, but a first ballistic missile. That was a huge step at the time.
I've visited this area many times, and its power and beauty never diminishes. It's a strange mix of primitive landscape and high-tech doomsday hardware, tucked into the southwest corner of America. One thing's for sure. The German scientists brought here after the war would have been totally cut off from the outside world.
The thing that bothered most of them that I knew more than anything was the summertime, because we get temperatures often here of 42 and 43 Celsius in July, June and July. And that was absolutely so incredible to them, they couldn't believe it.
It was a vast cry from being in Germany, because they're used to mountains and forests. Okay, we got the mountains, but we don't have the forests down here. We don't have the water that they have, and things are quite a desert.
It was here that the German scientists created the beginnings of the American space program. And it is also here, in this highly secret territory, that the number of UFO sightings really started to take off.
I was out stargazing, and I looked up, and I may have been for at the most 5 seconds. There was this large black triangle that just blacked out stars, and it was moving just across.
Making any noise?
No sound whatsoever, total silence. I never heard any reports about it, nothing.
And you have a massive database.
These are just a few.
Yeah. And what are these all these detail sightings of UFOs
Yeah.
in the White Sands, Alamogordo, New Mexico
Right.
region? I see they kind of range from the jocular to the more serious.
Anything I can get my hands on that I find.
So after all of these years, all of this study, your own sightings, what are you forced to conclude, Wayne?
I conclude that my government is lying to me.
About what?
About UFOs.
The American government has changed its own version of the events at Roswell so many times that my instincts, as a defense journalist, are that we're all being fed a false trail. Perhaps the work of the German scientists could offer a completely new explanation for the Roswell incident.
What evidence do you have that the Germans were working on flying saucer technology?
There certainly was an interest in that type of a vehicle after the war. It presented the possibility of some maneuverability that would be greater than what they would have had with the conventional piston or jet engines of that time using a fixed wing.
At the time of Roswell, the US Air Force was experimenting with radical new designs. Could this bizarre aircraft be based on this one? A design drawn from secret Nazi blueprints seized by the Americans after the war.
Some of these may indeed have reached the point of being test flown. However, if they did not have a particularly remarkable advantage over other aircraft that were being pursued at that time, they may not have really gone much further than that.
Perhaps the Roswell crash can be linked to the work of the German aircraft designers quartered at White Sands in 1947. I think it's very possible that what crashed was a secret prototype based on these radical designs. But I can't prove it. And the US government has changed its mind so many times that we may never know the truth. But what is certain is that UFO sightings in America were about to reach epidemic proportions. Not just in New Mexico, but over the skies of the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. They caused such panic that President Truman was forced to speak about them publicly. In a few short years, UFOs had reached the highest office in the land.
What? Oh, yes, we discussed it at every conference that we had with the military. There's always things like that going on. Flying saucers, and they've had other things, you know, if I'm not mistaken.
Flying saucers have invaded our planet. Washington, London, Paris.
America was about to go saucer crazy.
To the best of our knowledge, my wife and I are the only ones left alive.
I'm in Washington to investigate the extraordinary escalation of UFO sightings that occurred in America during the 50s. In 1952, a series of strange lights were seen over Capitol Hill. UFOs had arrived in the political heartland of America, causing mass panic.
In the midst of this big national flap, sightings occurred over Washington, D.C. This involved 3 radar sets in the Washington, D.C. area, which picked up targets that were traveling around in restricted airspace over the Capitol.
This couldn't be ignored. It had all the makings of a national emergency. Whether it was alien visitors or, as many in the military suspected, advanced Soviet spy technology, the Air Force needed to act fast. Jets were launched against the UFOs, and the military made sure their actions made headline news. The intention was to reassure the public, and it might have worked, but for the fact the following weekend, the 19th of July, the UFOs were sighted again. 1,000 people called in reports, including staff from President Truman's office. The government had to be seen to act. This man, General Sanford of the United States Air Force, was given the job of reassuring the nation and explaining to people what they'd seen.
In pursuit of this obligation, since 1947, we have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources. Of this great mass of reports, we have been able adequately to explain the great bulk of them.
So here he was saying specifically they're not a threat to the United States, the implication being the Air Force is doing its job when there's no threat out there, in spite of the fact that the Air Force internal documents had said, you know, well, it might be Soviet, and used that as a reason to investigate and so on.
The Air Force's commitment to act on the UFO problem would result in one of the biggest military investigations in American history.
The Air Force, which had secretly been investigating UFOs since 1947, were forced to set up an open inquiry. Called Project Blue Book, it promised to investigate each separate sighting report that was filed by the general public. In spite of Air Force intelligence claims there was nothing to worry about, the US Air Force was actually taking UFOs very seriously indeed.
The man at the forefront of Blue Book's investigations was Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Hynek was employed by the Air Force. He interviewed thousands of witnesses and collated some of the public's most bizarre encounters.
Have you ever seen a meteor with headlights?
No, I've never seen a meteor with headlights. But one might see a meteor that looked like it had headlights.
Well,
however,
I do not drink, and this had some kind of light on the back.
All right, good, fine.
Hynek was a skeptic. During the course of his investigations, he was able to attribute many of the sightings to natural phenomena.
All of them saying that they saw it predominantly in an eastern direction. Now, if it had been extremely close to any one of them, it could not have been seen to the east by all the people. And observers west of Elgin,
but Project Blue Book had severe limitations. No military sightings were included in its pages. Instead, they were immediately classified and buried deep in the files of the Pentagon. Much to Hynek's frustration, because reports by Air Force pilots, of which there were many, intrigued him very much. But now we can tell the story of one such sighting for the very first time. It involves the early reconnaissance missions by the United States over the Soviet Union. Thomas Hanley was an RB-47 radar operator, one of the first Cold War spies in the sky.
When you're flying, you are always aware of anything in your airspace. One particular night, the aircraft commander saw a bright light coming towards us. And all of a sudden, the light just went immediately to the other side of the aircraft. So we played cat and mouse with it, whatever it was, for an hour anyhow. But the ground was recording it, and they would lose it too on occasion. So there was something out there, something very strange. It was performing not like a normal aircraft would perform. It was just too fast and too maneuverable. I'm certain something different was out there, but I have no idea what it was.
The problem for the US Air Force is that this man is entirely credible. He's one of the best they have, highly trained at surveillance and working with what was then state-of-the-art technology. These are the hardest cases the Air Force had to deal with. As far as Tom Hanley is concerned, his questions were never answered, and I have to admit I'm at a loss to explain it myself. But in the meantime, the CIA was becoming very interested in the UFO phenomenon for their own purposes. The agency was responsible for surveillance of the Soviet Union, and they realized that UFOs might offer the perfect cover for their more clandestine activities.
This is a memo written by Walter B. Smith, the head of the CIA at the time. And it's important because it shows that the CIA were happy to leave the US Air Force with the problem of analysing each UFO sighting. I suggest, Smith says, that we discuss at an early board meeting the possible offensive or defensive utilisation of these phenomena for psychological warfare purposes. This is a pretty stunning document, but when you read something like this, what you've got to keep in mind, first and foremost, is its context.
The context, of course, was the Cold War and the struggle between America and the Soviet Union. But what really set the UFO story running for the CIA was the death in 1953 of this man, Joseph Stalin. I'm going to meet the former senior analyst of the Soviet desk at the CIA, who can tell me exactly how the CIA set about manipulating the UFO story in order to gain the upper hand in the Cold War.
Melvin, hi.
Dick, hi. Good to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Eisenhower had only been in office for 2 months, and Stalin died rather suddenly. And Eisenhower called in some of his major people, not only policy people and political people, but intelligence people. And so he went around the table in terms of what do we know about the Soviet Union, what do we know about the contenders for power, what do we know about the direction the Soviet Union might take in its policy. And he asked people who were also there from the CIA. And not only was there no speculation on what it would be like in the Soviet Union, and would the Soviet Union be more or less threatening to the United States, there was no intelligence collection. And I really think it was out of that discussion and that event that the beginning of the ideas that led to the U-2, the ability to conduct surveillance of the Soviet Union from the air with a high-altitude spy plane, I think it began with the turning point of Stalin's death and no understanding of what it meant for the United States.
This is the U-2. It's the direct result of American intelligence coming to terms with how little it really knew about post-Stalin Russia. We can't make sense of what happened next in ufology without getting to grips with this once highly secret machine. It triggered a wave of UFO sightings all across America.
What was needed were certain cover stories. What do you do when people are spotting aircraft and then telling reporters that they've seen something very unusual flying out of an airbase in Nevada? And frankly, this was the origin of a lot of the sightings that took place in the mid-50s, 1954, 55, 56, of unidentified flying objects, the UFOs. So the CIA was involved in encouraging people to believe that, yes, they saw UFOs, and the CIA and the military tried to be very helpful to reporters to get these stories out, to divert the attention of the country, and particularly the people in this region, about what they had actually seen.
We believe that UFOs are real, that they are from outer space, and that they are intelligently controlled.
And then it went into a small cloud. Again, we spotted as it came out of the cloud, and very shortly after that, it quickly disappeared. Traveled apparently on this side of the tower and went...
The CIA's strategy of encouraging public belief in UFOs seemed to be working, and the U-2's development and deployment was hidden behind a smokescreen of disinformation.
With a flying object of some sort that could hover, and such as I've never seen before.
Right here is where this flying saucer, this UFO landed. Right here about where I'm standing. And it was a big, huge thing, and I wondered what the heck it was. Now, within 2 or 3 seconds, it was out of sight.
That was in the southwest, and easy, you might think, to dismiss out of hand. But this isn't. Life magazine, a highly respected part of the American scene in the 1950s. Popular, but hard-headed journalism.
A very famous issue of the Life magazine that has Marilyn Monroe on the front. And if you can get your eyes off Marilyn Monroe and look in the upper right-hand corner, you see this, "Have we visitors from outer space?" or whatever the title was. The writers said, well, we have been to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Project Blue Book was headquartered. We've looked through their sighting files. We've talked to the people who were in Project Blue Book and some Air Force generals and so on. And it appears that the Air Force is now treating this subject seriously. And their conclusion in the article was that, that we're right on the hairy edge of saying, yeah, there really are interplanetary visitors being involved here. That's what people are seeing. And the Air Force doesn't seem to be denying that.
What the CIA has always done in these cases is to place false reports in the press. But you did have ways of supplying information to people you knew were Soviet assets or East European assets to send the Soviets looking in another direction.
The real targets of the flying saucer fever were, of course, the Russians. What did they make of the UFOs, I wonder?
Уважаемые пассажиры, электропоезд до станции «Аэропорт» отправится в 18 часов 4 минуты.
I've come to Moscow to talk to Igor Sinitsyn, a former KGB operative who was the personal aide to the Bureau's number 1, Yuri Andropov.
На этой, так сказать, позиции.
While in this position, I once had the chance to acquaint myself with a document regarding UFOs, which had been prepared by one of the military intelligence officers. So, when I read this series of articles on UFOs, I decided to give it to Andropov to read. Of course, I was somewhat nervous when I went to him with this article, because I thought that my boss would think that I was out of my mind. He read through the translation and began to study it very closely. Then, quite unexpectedly, Yuri Andropov opened his desk and took out a very thin file from the top drawer, gave it to me to read and said, "Only read it here and don't take it away."
Much to Sinitsin's surprise, the file contained highly classified UFO sightings occurring all over the Soviet Union. What people saw behind the Iron Curtain was what the CIA wanted them to see. Not classified American technology, but something from outer space. But back in America, the UFO story was about to enter a new phase. A reliable witness reported a clear sighting of a UFO and its alien occupants. The first convincing close encounter of the third kind. On the 24th of April 1964, America experienced its first credible close encounter of the third kind. Officer Lonnie Zamora was driving along a quiet stretch of road skirting the edge of the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico.
What the hell was that?
Suddenly, he caught a glimpse of something strange in the sky.
Whoa.
He left the road and set off for the desert, following the craft. He caught sight of a shiny object, now landed, about 200 yards away. As he looked over, he saw two figures in white coveralls, close to what looked like a flying saucer. Suddenly, without warning, the craft took off and headed straight for him. And as quickly as it had arrived, it disappeared off into the distance at high speed.
This statement by Lonnie Zamora is one of the most intriguing UFO reports on record. It made headline news at the time. Everyone acknowledged that Zamora was a first-class witness, a police officer, a man not prone to exaggeration. The Zamora case remains one of a handful of unexplained sightings in Project Blue Book.
When investigators arrived at the scene, they found an impression in the soil, surrounded by burnt brushwood. Zamora was so distraught that he insisted on seeing a priest before handing in his report. The US Air Force was under pressure to explain what had actually landed. But there is one man who claims he knows what Lonnie Zamora saw. Duke Gildenberg had access to top-secret flight logs at White Sands and carried out the official investigation into the case.
That very same day, we had a mission scheduled for the Surveyor unmanned spacecraft that was going to be attached to a small helicopter and then flown all around the range by contractors sampling lava and that kind of thing, which they might see on the moon. On board was the pilot, and then there was an engineer, and they were both in white coveralls. So to us, that identified it almost perfectly. It's too much of a coincidence. Two guys in white coveralls that were doing the mission anyway, and then the sampler, which left a print in the dirt that was identical to what it later left in the moon.
I find it hard to believe Gildenberg's explanation. Zamora was a trained police officer, and I'm sure would have known the difference between a helicopter and a flying saucer. To try and make sense of what Zamora saw, we need to go back to the U-2 and to an event that shook the world in 1960. When U-2 pilot Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union, Cold War tensions intensified. The wreckage of his spy plane was put on public display in Moscow. This was a huge propaganda coup for Khrushchev, and it signaled the end of the U-2's covert life.
It was understood very early in the U-2 program that it wouldn't be able to fly safely over the most denied areas of the Soviet Union forever. Best, it was given a few years. In fact, it flew operationally for just about 4 years, which was longer than anybody expected, before one of the aircraft was shot down. The CIA launched an effort to produce a more workable aircraft with similar or better performance, and one that would be so fast and so high-flying that even the best missile technology that anybody could be looking at in those days would have a very hard time hitting it.
Richard Bissell was head of the CIA's overflight program between 1956 and 1960. He was the man given the job of replacing the U-2. He had a radical idea about how this might be achieved.
We see here that he's urging his technical department to design a new aircraft for reconnaissance missions over Russia. According to Bissell, who had a very good grasp of the technological challenges, the optimal shape for that vehicle would be saucer-shaped.
The Avrocar, which appears for all the world to be a flying disc.
It wasn't just Bissell who had flying saucers on his mind. Just across the border, Avro, a Canadian-based company, had recruited talented British aerospace designer John Frost to work on a flying saucer. Frost was a visionary, and under his leadership, the company began experimenting with disc-shaped craft. Called the Avrocar, it was a handful to fly and could barely get off the ground, but it caught the eye of the United States Air Force. They bought all rights to the project, and then it simply disappeared. Nothing more was heard or seen of Avro's saucer designs for over 40 years. But flying discs did not die with the Avrocar. Buried in the depths of the archives, I've discovered some blueprints which reveal something quite fantastic. A supersonic saucer. Called the Silverbug, it was truly revolutionary. The plans show in detail a multi-jet engine craft that boasted amazing maneuverability and speed. It's an intriguing thought that this concept may tie in with the work of the German scientists who brought saucer technology to the US at the close of the Second World War. I believe Silverbug could explain what Lonnie Zamora witnessed in the New Mexico desert in April 1964. His description of a silver disc-shaped object appears to fit in with the Silverbug profile. There's plenty of evidence that a host of other covert technologies were being developed by the Air Force during the 1960s. and many of the sightings on record at the time can be traced back to their secret testing programs. But I've heard there was a significant rise in sightings in the UK at the same time. Could the two be linked, or was the British phenomenon part of something completely different? I'm going back to the UK to find out. I've decided to hunt for any evidence that the British government were concerned about UFO sightings. As an aerospace journalist, I've spent many hours poring over old Ministry of Defence memos. They are a revealing record of how past British governments reacted during times of high tension and paranoia over national security.
Well, there's a really sort of fantastic, typical British understatedness about all these reports emanating from the MOD round about the 1950s and 60s about UFO sightings. We have memos here from Winston Churchill, for example, who was Prime Minister in 1952, saying, "What does all this stuff about flying saucers amount to? What can it mean? What is the truth? Let me have a report at your convenience." Fantastic.
Lord Cherwell, head of the Air Ministry, drafted this reply to Churchill. It was typically dismissive. It explained UFO sightings as deliberate hoaxes, optical illusions, mistaken identification, or known astronomical phenomena. But Cherwell was not privy to US intelligence. He had no idea how the increase in UFO sightings in America could be linked with secret developments in defense technology.
Here we have quite an interesting file from the MOD, the numbers of unexplained, in inverted commas, aerial sightings reported to the Ministry of Defence from 1959 until 2000. The sightings rise modestly from 1959, when you have 22 sightings, and then up to 95 in 1966. But in 1967, they really jump. They jump from almost 100 to 362 sightings, which is really quite significant and remarkable.
As the Cold War ramped up, there was a significant expansion of the American military presence on British bases throughout the 60s.
I think the height of those tensions, there was something in the order of 18 or 20 US bases on British soil, and you know the tension was ratcheting up, and there was many incidents where there were full air defence alerts, aircraft scrambled, and obviously until aircraft had been able to sort of identify what had been picked up on radar as Russians, they remained until that point UFOs effectively.
But there were some very mysterious cases which appear to have baffled the MOD at the time. I'm thinking of the Robin Peck incident, for example.
The case you're referring to happened on the Norfolk coast near Brancaster, at a little village called Docking, and you've got the American bases at Sculthorpe and Lakenheath, not very far away. This case happened in the summer of 1969, quite late at night, after midnight, and his light suddenly failed, and his engine started. He felt this, what he described as like a wave of static electricity. And he looked around at about 200 feet from the ground was what he described as a huge inverted mushroom, a brilliant blue ice blue colour. Suddenly, inexplicably, it just disappeared, almost in the blink of an eye towards Norwich, leaving this glow in the sky. He was so shaken by what he'd seen that the following morning he went to the police station in Docking and made a full report. These reports went to the Ministry of Defence in London and they were passed around from one division to another. They ended up with the Defence Intelligence people. And there was a little comment on the file that basically said, maybe this was a UFO.
I could find no explanation in the Ministry of Defence archives revealing what Peck actually witnessed. Which is not surprising, since only a tiny group at the highest level of the MOD had any idea of what the Americans were flying out of these bases.
With the expansion of US bases in the UK at bases like Mildenhall, do you think this myth about UFOs could have just migrated across the Atlantic to protect US activities at these bases?
Well, really, you're dealing with a generic problem here. You're dealing with sophisticated technology, breakthrough technology, and trying to protect the origin of that technology and the capability of that technology. And it's quite possible that a story that worked for you in the United States in the 1950s could be applied to the deployment of U-2. You needed to protect not only the capabilities of these sophisticated instruments, you needed to protect, in some cases, the United States' role in deploying these instruments, because this was a sensitive issue often to a host country.
Some of the strange UFO sightings in Britain and the United States might be explained by activities at a secret base here in Nevada. So secret, in fact, that, according to the Pentagon, it still doesn't officially exist.
From a defence journalist standpoint, it doesn't get any stranger than this. Just behind me there is Nellis Air Force Base. Nellis is at the southernmost tip of the Nellis Air Force Range, a closed-off area totally barred to the public that's about the size of Switzerland. And nestling within the Nellis Air Force Range is Area 51, the world's most secret Air Force base.
When Richard Bissell of the CIA urged his designers to think out of the box, this is where their imaginations ran wild. It's the testing ground for the US Air Force's most secret technology. When the U-2's covert life ended, this is what Bissell's designers came up with. The Blackbird is the apex of aerospace technology.
When the forerunner of this aircraft first flew, the CIA's A-12, in 1962, from Groom Lake, otherwise known as Area 51 in Nevada, its mission and the aircraft itself was super black. That is to say, it was a super classified aircraft. It's very easy to imagine how anyone catching a glimpse of this aircraft in 1962 might have mistaken it for a UFO. Everything about this aeroplane is strange. It's black, its shape is extraordinary, and its speed, of course, in excess of Mach 3, that's 3 times the speed of sound, would have made it one of the most extraordinary sights that anyone could have seen at that time.
Blackbird missions were flown out of the UK at the height of the Cold War. The plane flew at over 100,000 feet at the very edge of space. It was so fast that when it overflew the Soviet Union, it could simply outrun any missile attack. But it wasn't so much American spy planes that were worrying the Russians. There was something else in the skies that was causing them alarm. An incident over the small town of Petrozavodsk would trigger the largest study of UFOs on the face of the Earth. Russia's X-Files had begun. On September the 20th, 1977, high over the Russian town of Petrozavodsk, a group of soldiers were on routine maneuvers. Suddenly, a bright star appeared radiating pulsating beams of light. The object lingered over the town like a huge jellyfish. After a few minutes, it wrapped into a bright half-disk and shot off. News of the event reached the Kremlin, and Yuri Andropov, head of the KGB, gave an extraordinary order that the entire Soviet army should watch the skies for unidentified flying objects. I'm in Russia, on my way to meet the two men, Colonel Boris Sokolov and Dr. Yuli Platov, who were ordered by Andropov to coordinate the whole operation.
Oh, Colonel Sokolov. Nick Cook.
Yuri.
Hello. Thank you.
В армии служило порядка там 7,5
At that time, the army had a total of 7.5 million serving personnel, stationed across the whole of the Soviet Union, which comprised a sixth of the world land mass. The army controlled the monitoring of these abnormal events.
пассивного мониторинга вот этих событий аномальных.
In the beginning, these reports were numerous. Literally, every week there was someone who had seen a dish landing with somebody coming out of it. Even when a sighting was not considered sensitive, it was still stamped top secret.
Буквально каждую неделю кто-нибудь, так сказать, видел там.
The observations continued every night for 13 years. No other nation has conducted such a long and thorough research program into unidentified flying objects. But as Sokolov tells me, the evidence was inconclusive.
I would like to say that it is absolutely certain that in those 13 years there was not a single report of anybody's contact with aliens. Most of the sightings, which were taken by observers and thought to be something abnormal, were in fact, as our research has shown, connected to technical experiments by our own military.
And as Dr. Platov explains, even the Petrozavodsk incident, which led to Andropov's UFO surveillance operation, was nothing more than a secret missile launch. That the strange lights and jellyfish-shaped object was in reality the burning rocket engine and its exhaust plume. But not every sighting could be so easily dismissed.
Even though we could explain some of these sightings, there were many unexplained events which caused scientists to scratch their heads and which still remain unanswered today.
Физики, которые ответа так до сих пор нету.
For some, these inexplicable sightings fueled concerns that the Americans were developing a radical piece of aerospace technology. Something that behaved and looked like a UFO, that could fly undetected into Russian airspace. and the Russian fears were well-founded. This is stealth, a quantum leap in aerospace technology. The Americans had built an invisible plane.
If you took one or two looks at that airplane and you saw how strange the shape was, it wouldn't take you very long to figure out that they were aiming at a very, very low level of radar cross-section. What was done with the first real stealth program was to produce something that had the radar signature of a small shotgun pellet or perhaps maybe a small bird.
My view is that it was advantageous for the Americans to keep up this kind of hype regarding UFOs. We guessed it was policy to conduct a campaign of misinformation as far as the general public was concerned.
Stealth was an enormous breakthrough, and nobody out in the wider world really believed it was possible. Nobody could even imagine that it was possible to do that.
The Americans had won the technological race. By waging a campaign of disinformation on their own people with the UFO cover story, the CIA were able to hide the existence of stealth from Soviet surveillance for 10 years. But stealth couldn't begin to explain the series of alleged alien encounters which were about to shock the American Southwest.
The rectum had been partially removed. The eyes were bulging out. I was horrified at the thought of what could do this in broad daylight.
I really did believe something strange was going on. We had one up north where we believed the animal was paralyzed and was alive when it was being mutilated.
These horrific events took place all over the plains of New Mexico, an area that had been witnessing UFO sightings continuously since the 1940s. I'm on my way to meet Edmund Gomez. Gomez was a cattle rancher farming right next to the town of Los Alamos, famous for the development of the atomic bomb. We met up and headed out to a desolate corner of his ranch. Where are we going? Where are you taking me to?
I'm taking you to our animal graveyard. Normally we would bury carcasses that would die from disease or from natural causes, but during the cattle mutilations that we had, we never buried any of the animals, so in case we ever needed any body parts, in the future, especially the bones.
The mutilations themselves took place over quite a time period, didn't they?
Yes, they on our ranches from 1976 through 1982, approximately.
When you found a mutilated cow, typically what kind of wounds would you find on the animal?
The rectum had been cored out, the lower lip had been removed, and the reproductive tract also had been removed. The organs that were removed precisely without spilling of any blood, and it was very, very neatly done.
Many of the ranchers believed the cattle mutilations were the result of UFOs, that aliens were dissecting the animals for experimentation.
Usually when you find an animal that dies of a disease or natural causes, the scavengers will attack the animal and attack the fleshy parts that they can, that are easy to tear into. And this was not torn flesh.
But for Gomez, there were other clues.
We saw this light kind of flying over our pastures, and all of a sudden it kind of just came to a standstill, It looked like it was saucer-shaped, but had two decks, and had two sets of lights on it, flashing one on top and one down towards the bottom. You know, when you look at them, you know, you think, well, gosh, that looks like the typical flying saucer. When all of a sudden, the lights inside the cockpit of this vehicle went on, and when the lights went on, I could see the props of a chopper.
And as Gomez tells me, he has his own theories about the fate of the targeted animals.
They would put ropes or chains around the legs of the animal and lift them up and haul them off somewhere. Do their thing, come back, bring them back, and not lay them down, but drop them. Because we found several animals that had broken legs, broken backs, broken hips, and so forth.
And why dump the cow, you know, leave the carcass here?
We felt that that whoever was doing this did it and brought it back and said, we're doing this and there's nothing you can do about it. There were a lot of consistencies with the way that they were harvesting these animals.
For Edmund Gomez, there are many unanswered questions. He wants the cattle mutilations, which put him and his family out of the ranching business, reinvestigated to bring closure to the whole bizarre and sinister affair.
Well, I think Gomez's hunch that this was some sort of covert testing activity was bang on the money. From the way the cows were mutilated, from the organs that were removed from the cows, it seems very clear that this was some kind of covert testing, covert monitoring program of some kind of contamination in that region. It also seems very clear that someone is trying to put in some kind of linkage between this mutilation activity and UFOs, trying to dress helicopters up, for instance, to make them look like UFOs in an area where people are very superstitious, very fearful of things they don't understand. So it's clear to me that some kind of disinformation campaign is going on, but the reality is whatever was going on up there has nothing to do with extraterrestrials or UFOs.
In the alien encounters I have examined so far, military and defense technologies seem to be at the heart of what's going on. But parallel to these stories are other reports of more direct encounters between aliens and humans, which seem to be of a wholly different order. These are the chilling first-hand accounts of alien abduction. The most challenging aspect of the UFO phenomenon is alien abduction. Throughout the 80s and 90s, stories of abduction swept across the US. Over 2 million Americans claim to have been taken by aliens. These stories followed a pattern. Typically, abductees claimed they had been taken in their sleep to an alien craft, where they were subjected to invasive surgery. Samples were taken. Probes were implanted. Some victims reported they had been abducted not just once, but many times. I've come to meet Travis Walton. He was the first alien abductee of this epidemic, and his story, which was widely reported, had a powerful effect on the public imagination. I caught up with him near the Apache Sitgreaves Forest in Arizona, where the whole incident unfolded.
Well, there was a group of 7 of us men. we were working up in the mountains in the woods. We had a tree cutting contract up there. And we just finished a long, hard day's work, and we were headed home. We'd worked late that night, so it was starting to get dark. And as we were driving down this rough track there, we saw light coming through the trees.
What the hell is that? Travis, man, what the hell are you doing? Come back! Travis!
Back then, you know, I was a kind of a wild sort of a guy. You know, I was showing off, you know. It was stupid. Instead, something hit me.
Several nights later, Travis Walton reappeared, dazed and confused.
I didn't know how much time had gone by. There's something in the conversation, you know, made that apparent to them. He said, "Hey, feel your face," and I felt, and I had this, you know, week's growth of beard, and I was just totally shocked by this. So you've been gone 5 days. I had enough trouble just dealing with the reality of this incredible thing that had happened to me. You know, it was just so hard to explain what I'd been through, and there was nobody to relate to. And, you know, 29 years ago, there was nobody to turn to, and I was just on my own.
Travis's story seems incredible, but it's only one of many such tales. Does the weight of evidence add up to a believable pattern of abduction? In order to understand the nature of the contact experience in the 1980s, we need to look at the first reported cases back in the 1950s.
They come here to commune with outer space.
To start the message now, group, here we go. We are your friends. We are your friends. Please contact us.
Contactees were a group of people who claimed they'd been visited by human-like aliens from planets such as Venus and Saturn. Unlike Travis Walton's aliens, these visitors were reputed to be benign.
We are your friends.
Living in the shadow of the arms race, contactees preached peace towards all species, whether alien or terrestrial, and campaigned for disarmament. As Cold War paranoia reached its peak, the CIA ruthlessly misled the American people about UFOs in order to hide their surveillance programs against the Soviet Union. Melvin Goodman believes that the contactees were simply the victims of this dark political climate.
I wonder, in terms of a general disinformation campaign, whether if you plant a seed, basically from then on, there's nothing you can do to control it.
Well, that's the blowback principle. And certainly once you get involved in UFO sightings and trying to encourage the people of the Southwest that there were indeed UFO sightings and making people who may have been lunatics appear to be heroes, there's no telling when that will end, and there's no telling what kind of blowback will take place. And even the people who started this kind of mythology can end up believing their own myth because they start to hear this story played out over and over again.
Of course, disinformation is a factor behind tales of UFO sightings and alien contact. But I also think there's something else. Our need to believe. Anthropologist Charles Ziegler has studied many abductee testimonies.
These people were not mentally impaired. Many of them were, in fact, highly trained. They believed these things. It gave them the same kind of satisfaction that religion gives other people. The notion that we're not alone, that there is some entity that's looking after us, that there's a better place waiting for us when we die.
The chief skeptic of all, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who investigated UFOs for the US military, also became a believer. It was Hynek's interviews and expertise that formed the basis of the 1977 film Close Encounters, directed by Steven Spielberg.
I think that we're all interested in having in the re-enchantment of the universe. We want to feel that there are transcendent things out there that we're not aware of and that bode good for the human race somehow. I think this is just a natural human feeling.
But what really fascinates me as a defense journalist is that you are as likely to find believers in UFOs among the higher reaches of the aerospace industry as you are in Hollywood. This is a report into future technology commissioned in 1968 by McDonnell Douglas, then one of the biggest aerospace and defense contractors in the world. What's extraordinary about this document is that it takes the existence of UFOs seriously. It recommends using UFOs and copying their design to make the next quantum leap in aerospace technology.
Some UFOs may be extraterrestrial vehicles. They certainly have not been proven otherwise. The existence of extraterrestrial vehicles indicates vehicles could be built which would have capabilities quite useful to McDonnell Douglas Corporation.
The report even suggested interviewing contactees to gather data. And if they were thinking that over 25 years ago, what advances might be on the horizon today?
I'm here in Seattle to meet someone who's built a device in the basement of his garage, indeed is flying it there, that he and others claim is able to do so by defying our current understanding of physics. As unlikely as it sounds, I'm wondering whether what I'm about to witness may just be our first small step towards the stars.
This strange device is made of balsa wood and glue and covered in a layer of aluminium foil.
So Tim, tell me, why is this lifter demonstrating this levitational effect?
Well, there's an interaction that occurs between the corona wire, which runs around the top, and the foil underneath.
Yeah.
And there's a 3 to 4 centimeter air gap in between there, and literally a high voltage electric field occurring. Now, there's been some controversy. Is this an ion wind effect? Is it the high voltage literally taking air molecules with it and creating an upward thrust? Or is it something more?
Nobody knows for sure how the lifter flies, but one popular theory is that high voltage current flows between the wires, suspended on the top of the craft, through the air, down to the aluminium foil wrapped around the frame. The current literally drags air molecules down with it, creating a downforce called an ion wind, which provides the thrust needed to lift the airframe skywards.
This technology, not just the lifter, but this whole scope of technologies, is almost like looking at the internal combustion engine back in the 1800s. We're trying to take it and say, look, these are real technologies. They have the same flaws that any other technology does, but hopefully they can do things that other technologies can't.
So do you think what we're watching here could be the modest beginnings of a whole new industry?
Yeah, I think the lifter is literally sort of like the tricycle, and it may not end up becoming the technology that builds the starships of tomorrow, but it at least shows us that given the right circumstances, given the right power, it will work.
I'm nearing the end of my journey, and I feel as if I've come full circle. Because what Tim Ventura's lifter reminds me of is the Nazis' secret experiment in anti-gravity propulsion I discovered in the Wenceslas mine. So what's the truth about UFOs? The story of successive attempts to develop radically new forms of flight, conducted under the strictest secrecy, is inextricably bound up with our relationship with UFOs over the last 60 years. Whether it's Allied pilots buzzed by strange balls of fire in 1942, or the Roswell incident 5 years later, there is a strong case to be made that secret military technology offers a convincing explanation for many UFO stories. For me, what is so striking about Roswell is that it's the first good example of an officially sanctioned UFO disinformation exercise. It showed the CIA that UFOs could provide perfect cover for their Cold War activities. It didn't take much for the CIA to spin the extraterrestrial story into the hearts and minds of the American public. And once it was there, all manner of experimental technology could, if it was spotted, be put down to the UFO phenomenon. But there are some cases that I just can't explain. The sightings of UFOs over Capitol Hill in 1952 are still baffling. And Tom Hanley's aerial encounter remains as testimony to the possibility we are not alone. What is certain is that real-world UFOs, the man-made ones, continue to develop. Recently, a series of sonic booms were heard exploding across California and Nevada. Something was in the sky that could be heard and felt, but not seen. Some informed observers, and I'm one of them, believe it was an aircraft travelling at several thousand miles per hour, a secret project known as Aurora.
There is no trace of Aurora's physical existence, no evidence of government spending on its development or deployment. But there are tantalizing images that point to its existence. Pictures, for example, like this one. It shows a donut-shaped exhaust pattern, a sign perhaps that Aurora makes use of something called a pulse detonation wave engine. And it delivers a hell of a punch, easily enough power to drive an aircraft to 6 times the speed of sound. But perhaps the most intriguing are these images. This is a weather satellite image that shows a very interesting contrail originating out of Area 51 in Nevada and moving all the way across the United States, out over the Atlantic, on across Europe, and into Russia and China. Whatever it is, it's moving in excess of 8,000 miles an hour. If it is the contrail of a high-altitude hypersonic aircraft, in my book it's the best evidence yet that Aurora is real.
And Aurora's flights will probably give birth to a new wave of UFO sightings. Because whether aliens exist or not, many of us want to believe in them. Perhaps the only way we will ever find out for sure is if we make the leap into deep space ourselves. That day may come sooner than we expect.
UFOs, alien abductions, men in black. Are you brave enough to find out more? Visit channel4.com/science. topicality with a twist over on our new channel Morpho Now with The Last Word. Next on Channel 4, Ever Fallen in Love with Someone You Shouldn't Have, the exclusive John Peel tribute video.